Hey, I'm catiewahwah and you're watching The Record Review. Hey, so this week I'm going to be reviewing Ghost Culture's self-titled debut. The cover art is in black and white, which is a motif that we see repeated a lot in Ghost Culture's videos and in his styling. And also straight away there's this elusive persona being presented to us because we can see that it's clearly a portrait of Ghost Culture, but his face is almost completely obscured and in shadow. And I found it interesting how in the gatefold there's another portrait, but again there's that obscured face. There's this real sense of mystery about who Ghost Culture is. The record sleeve has the lyrics for all of the tracks on this album on it, and then on the other side we have a bunch of dedications, and I always find those really interesting to see who else other than the actual artist has had a say in what this album eventually became. The vinyl itself is white. I thought it was cool how, although it is coloured, it sticks with that monochromatic theme, like a pop of colour while still maintaining that black and white aesthetic. When I got this album, it also came with a whole bunch of stuff. So of course there's the MP3 download codes. This album also came with a CD of 4 of the tracks from the album performed live. And then because I bought the album at Rough Trade East on Brick Lane, they were actually having him perform in the store later on that week. So I also got a wristband for me and my friend to go see Ghost Culture actually perform live in January. So that was really cool, and that has definitely affected the way that I've reviewed the album, and I'll be mentioning how the live performance contrasts with the actual studio production of the album. So who is Ghost Culture? Well, he's not as mysterious as these photos make him seem. He's actually a guy called James Greenwood, and he's signed to Fantasy Sound, which is DJ and producer Errol Alkan's label, and it focuses a lot on electronic music. Greenwood previously worked on Daniel Avery's Drone Logic album, and Avery is also signed to Fantasy. He got quite a lot of attention in 2013 when he released the Mouth EP, and Mouth actually features on this album. He also got quite a lot of praise for the follow-ups Giudecca and Arms, which were released in 2014. And then this self-titled album was released in January this year. One of the really interesting things about this album, I think, is that Greenwood has said that he wrote this album out of his bedroom. So he has like a really simple setup of just like one synth, one sequencer, and a couple of effects, which I think has resulted in him creating a really emotional and intimate sound on this album. I'm satisfied. So what is that sound that he's created? Well, overall I'd say that this album is a really confident new take on the intersection of electronic and indie. It's very different to anything that anyone else is doing right now. It's technically electronic because the instruments that he's using are synths and sequencers, and it is an electronic sound, but it's also got quite a few indie sensibilities. He uses analog electronic instruments, and the vocals also really reflect those indie sensibilities. The album is composed of these atmospheric layered beats and melodies which really transport you to this ethereal dream world, which I think is probably Greenwood's imagination. From the opening track, Mouth, we know that we're being transported to somewhere else. Mouth begins with, and I timed this, so it's true, almost 2 minutes of beats before we hear a single lyric on the album. They're layering and pulling you into this album. It really feels like you're being transported and you're going through something into Greenwood's imagination and his emotional world. The song's title, Mouth, is actually repeated as a motif throughout Ghost Culture's work. In the video for Arms, we begin by entering through a disembodied mouth, and we go through that into this abstracted world of shapes and patterns. And then finally at the end we emerge again from that same mouth. So that motif of the mouth as a portal to something is really interesting. Greenwood has a really interesting description of the album. He called it music that needed rather than wanted to come out. And that's certainly true about the album. A lot of the tracks have a real emotional drive to become something, even though they are still quite abstracted. He also said, "I find myself within myself. Words, rhythm, and melody that urges to take up the form of a recording and become something tangible." And I think that that really summarizes the album. It's about that attempt to express what's going on in our imaginations to other people and that process of translation. So what does that all end up sounding like? Well, when I was listening to the album, I found that there are a lot of bleak dystopian textures. And what I mean by that is that I felt like I was listening to the soundtrack for an 80s sci-fi movie like Blade Runner. And while that might be partly because of the choice of instruments, instruments, I also feel like there is something quite bleak and mysterious about this album. Ghost Culture seems to be drawing influence from artists like Joy Division, and also a lot of people have compared him to Depeche Mode. I heard a lot of Morrissey minus the Ma riffs. There's a really interesting comparison that Errol Alkan made. He said that the vocals sound very similar to the Strokes, and as soon as I heard that I thought, yeah, if you took the vocals away from the music and put them in a more traditional indie setup, it would sound exactly like the Strokes. So let's get a little bit more into the instrumentation itself, because I think that this album is really characterized by its choice of instrument. This album is defined by its exploration of the physical capabilities of analog electronic instruments. There's a real love of the possibilities of synthesizers, sequencers, and drum machines throughout this album. Ghost Culture uses a vintage KORG mono-poly synthesizer on this album as one of his main instruments, and it's also apparently the first instrument that Greenwood really felt that he could use. I found an interview that he gave to Dummy Mag where he said, "I'd heard songs and melodies before, they were all in my head, and then I heard this sound come out of this one synth." And he goes on to say how he mastered that sound, and now he feels that he's able to express himself and those melodies in his head through this one instrument. And I think that that's a really cool idea and moment, that an artist can find that specific instrument that allows them to express their creativity in its purest form. The synthesizers on Ghost Culture have a really interesting sound to them. They're mysterious, they're dripping, they're echoing, and it really adds to that bleak dystopian feel that I was talking about earlier. And it's interesting to think about how perhaps the same songs played with different instruments would have a very different feel, and probably wouldn't be as effective in creating this dreamlike quality to the album. The way that Ghost Culture uses instruments, though, is also very experimental. He's really trying to figure out the limits of those instruments and what they can express. And I think this is where seeing him live really clarified that in my mind. When I saw Ghost Culture, he was stood up on stage and he had all of these instruments surrounding him, and he kind of looked like a mad scientist or an alchemist just concocting potions live on stage. It felt very spontaneous, as he would just randomly lean over to add in a drum beat and loop that, and it felt like anything could happen in that moment, which I like to imagine would probably have played quite a big role as he was composing the album to start with. One of my favourite songs from the album, Lucky, was amazing live, because he was actually looping himself live when he repeats Lucky, 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 and there was a sense that that was happening for the first time and that he might loop himself wrong, or it didn't feel as controlled as a lot of electronic music can feel. Similarly, the spirit of experimentation extended to the choice of instrument itself. I said that he's very dependent upon these analog electronic instruments, and that is true for the most part, but for the song Glaciers, when he performed that live, he just pulled out an electric guitar, and that was the only instrument that he used to perform the entire song. And that was a really interesting way of playing with our expectations of what this album should be. It was quite funny actually, because I remember he even commented as he pulled the guitar out, he was like, "Oh, what's he doing with the guitar?" Because the crowd was definitely surprised by the appearance of this guitar. We get so used to the idea that someone's only allowed to use a certain type of instrument to perform their music, and he wasn't. Ghost Culture's vocals are actually quite experimental and unusual for electronic music. They're quite breathy. I could definitely hear the influence of Ian Curtis, Morrissey, and yes, Julian Casablancas. The vocals are sometimes serene, somewhat removed, and almost dreamlike as they soar through these oscillating beats around them. And the lyrics themselves are very minimalist. They're elegantly reduced to a couple of words at a time, sometimes even just one word, emerging through and burrowing beneath the textures echoing around them. It was actually really useful to have those lyrics on the LP sleeve, because the words themselves frequently distort and muddle within the mix, which is a great effect in itself, but I also wanted to be able to appreciate the lyrics. The effect of those minimalist lyrics is that as you're listening to the album, these disparate words seem to be echoing through the dream world. And if you've seen the film Inception, it has a very similar effect to that, where words kind of echo through different layers of dreams. And I think that that kind of mastery of a vocabulary is really cool, and specifically within Ghost Culture's lyrics, I think it seems almost like poetry. So I was really interested to find on the sleeve a dedication to someone called Natalie Long. Ghost Culture had thanked Long for her mastery of words, and I assumed that that means that she contributed the lyrics to the album. She's a writer, and she's actually got a book of short stories out. When I started to compare the work that she's published with the lyrics on the album, I realized that they're incredibly similar and that it's clearly very much her work on this album. And when I started to think about that, it made me realize that the lyrics on this album are actually not that central. It's really more about these musical dreamscapes that Ghost Culture is creating, and his ideas are very much being transmitted through those rather than the words that he's singing. The instrumentation becomes his main means of expression, which is very different from a lot of other artists, which is why in this review I focus more on the experience of listening to the music as a whole rather than any specific lyrical analysis. However, I do like analysing the lyrics, so let's have a little go at that. This album feels like an abstract descent into something, whether that be a dream world or an imagination or something else entirely. There are a few clues within the lyrics about what's going on, so let's have a look at them. Although the opening track Mouth is mostly instrumental, when we do finally hear Greenwood's vocals, he ends with the phrase, "I'll defend her." And as this is the track that acts as the entrance into that Ghost Culture realm, it seems that it's being set up as a sort of quest or journey that he's going to be taking through the rest of the music. He's going to the depths of this ethereal world in order to defend something, although whether that her is literal or metaphorical is unclear. The second song, Giudecca, is really interesting lyrically, and it's interesting to me because it's very unclear and confusing. So Giudecca is technically an island in Venice, and the song could be named after the place in Venice. That's very, very possible. However, as I was researching it, I found out that Giudecca is also a homonym for the central part of hell in Dante's Inferno, which is called Giudecca, named after Judas, and which is reserved for traitors. So if that is at all an influence on the album, then it sets up this idea of an Orpheus-like descent into the underworld of the imagination and dreams, or even into the subconscious, in order to rescue something. So as I said, I'm not sure at all whether that is what Giudecca is referring to, but it does set up quite a cool way to listen to the music, as if it is this journey through hell or Hades. And of course with the final track, The Fog, it feels like we've emerged from that place. There's actually a co-writer credit on The Fog to Gabriel Stebbing of Metronomy and Nightworks, and I'd be interested to know what role he played on that track and how he influenced it. As the final song on the album, it feels like we're waking up, emerging from something, and the lyrical style changes and elongates. It's as if we're coming out of his mind, and there's a real sense of clarity, suggesting that the previous events of the album took place within something that was fuzzy and dreamlike. And from the lyrics themselves on that, it feels like he's learnt something from that journey we've been on with him, and that he's actually given up on whatever it was that he was defending. Having seen Ghost Culture live, I think it's quite fun to compare that live performance with the studio album, because the performance was really fantastic, but quite different. James Greenwood, in that same interview with Dummy Mag, actually said that the album was meant to be performed. It's a performance. I'm singing my songs, there's nothing in front of me. I've been to too many gigs where it's just people behind a screen, and it's really disheartening. They could be on Facebook. That was always in my mind with my arrangements. The Ghost Culture was meant to be performed. And that performance was certainly quite something. Greenwood stands on stage surrounded by these instruments, but he doesn't just play the instruments. It's like watching a mechanical music man who's incorporating dance and movement into the music production. He danced constantly, whether he was actually, say, tapping out a beat on a drum machine or just singing. He would dance, making these jerky movements where it was almost as if his limbs weren't quite attached to his body, and it just constantly seemed like he was full of energy. He was this one-man show, but he was always doing something to watch. There was even a bit of Morrissey-style mic lead swinging. And if the album itself is him trying to communicate his imagination to the listener, then I think that the live performance is in the same way about him trying to communicate his imagination to whoever's watching him. You could really see that he was trying to let something that was sort of trapped within him become tangible, become something that we could then understand and interpret. At the live show, he also had these antique lamps set up around him, and those would flash on and off in time with the beats that he was making, which is an image that I've seen repeated in his Giudecca video and also in a video performance that he did of Lucky. And those lamps seem to represent that idea of older technology that the name Ghost Culture also evokes. One thing that I found really interesting about the live performance is that, unlike the album, he didn't end with The Fog, and instead the live performance ended with a complete descent into these hypnotic analog beats, which were just weaving and looped over each other until you completely lost yourself in them. And by the end of the performance, I felt like I was sort of waking up out of something, and I found it interesting that I had had a similar experience by the end of the live performance as I had from listening to the album on vinyl, despite the fact that that experience had been caused in different ways. So overall, what's the verdict on Ghost Culture? Well, I think that this album is really interesting. It's very different from anything else that's going on, particularly in electronic music. I really love the use of the analog instruments and the fact that he's so ready and willing to experiment with the capabilities of the music that he's making. I feel quite confident he's going to keep experimenting and keep doing things. It's a great album, and I would definitely recommend it to anyone. Even if you don't think you like electronic music, have a go. I'm going to give it 4 stars, partly because I kind of think that Ghost Culture is going to do something even better. I think that there's a lot of potential in the album. It's maybe not as polished as it could be. I kind of like that about it, but I think that perhaps with a bit more time, perhaps as he matures more as an artist, he'll produce something even better. But of course, most importantly, should you get it on vinyl? Well, I think that it really depends on how you listen to music. By which I mean that James Greenwood himself has said that this album is very much an album to listen to in your bedroom with your headphones on. It's a very intimate and emotional album that you kind of want to listen to on your own. So I think that if you're like me and you have your record player set up in your bedroom, then that's gonna work just fine because you can kind of listen to it on your own. But if you tend to listen to music in your bedroom, say from an MP3 player with headphones or from a computer, then I think that that's probably going to be the best way for you to experience this album. Just whatever is the way that you sit alone with music, if that makes sense. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and be sure to let me know in the comments what you think of Ghost Culture. If you've been a fan of his for a while, what do you think of the album? Or if you're just encountering him now, do you think you'll check him out? What are your first impressions of his music? Also, if you have any requests for future reviews, be sure to let me know in the comments down below. I have been adding them all to a very big list, and I assure you they are always greatly appreciated. And if you're not already and you would like to be, then be sure to click subscribe, and then you can get notifications for all of my new videos. Next week, I'm going to be reviewing Marika Hackman's debut album, We Slept at Last. But until then, bye! Hi, so this month there are a lot of really exciting albums being released and about to be released.